The morning had started like any other. The sun had barely risen over the streets of Cleveland, Ohio, painting the neighborhood in soft gold, and the Miller family was on their way to a small weekend getaway. Little Emily, barely 2 years old, sat in the backseat of her parents' SUV, humming softly to herself. Her mother, Linda, had one hand on the steering wheel, the other gently brushing Emily's hair, while her father, Thomas, hummed along to the radio. None of them could have predicted how quickly life could change. A sudden screech of tires. A twisting of metal, glass shattering. The SUV was hit head-on by a speeding truck. Time slowed. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, the chaos unfolding like a nightmare too vivid to be real. Thomas had only minor injuries. Linda and Emily were rushed to the hospital. But Emily's condition was critical. She had suffered severe trauma, and the doctors feared the worst. In the sterile, cold light of the emergency room, the pediatric surgeon spoke to Linda and Thomas with measured, calm urgency. "Your daughter has sustained severe damage to her left eye," the doctor explained. "We need to perform an urgent surgery to save her vision and possibly her life. The injury is extensive. We may have to use a donor eye if the damage is irreparable." Linda's hands trembled. Thomas's face went pale. But what shocked both parents was the following words. "There is a possible donor, a living donor, who can provide one of their eyes immediately. It's her mother, if she's willing." Silence. Linda's heart stopped for a fraction of a second. She looked at her baby, her tiny, fragile Emily, and then at the surgeon. "I'll do it," she whispered, barely audible. The operating room was tense. Emily, the little girl with golden brown hair and fragile limbs, was prepped for surgery. Linda lay on a stretcher nearby, ready to give up one of her eyes so that her daughter could live. Hours later, the surgery was over. Emily's left eye had been replaced with her mother's donated eye. It was an unprecedented procedure, and the recovery would be long and arduous. But Emily survived. From that day on, Emily grew up seeing her mother differently, through a lens of loss and sacrifice. As a child, she didn't fully understand what had happened. She only saw that her mother had given up something permanent for her. But children are honest in ways adults aren't. Emily didn't feel gratitude at first. She felt resentment. Every time she looked at her mother, she saw incompleteness. She saw vulnerability. She saw imperfection. And that image, implanted in her earliest memories, shaped how she understood people, love, and trust. As the years passed, Emily noticed the small things. How her mother sometimes flinched at bright lights, how she avoided reflections in mirrors, how people stared when they noticed the asymmetry. Emily started keeping her distance emotionally, nurturing a quiet anger she didn't yet have words for. In school, children are merciless. Emily's peers noticed her eye, but she had learned to respond with silence. To hide behind humor, to avoid questions. But the curiosity in their eyes mirrored her own questions about her mother. Why didn't she just fix it? Why me? By the time Emily was 10, she had developed a complex emotional armor. She didn't talk much about her feelings, and she didn't ask for reassurance. The bond with her mother was strained, marked by unspoken tension. She loved Linda, of course, in the basic way children love those who give them life, but the resentment lingered, a shadow over their interactions. Meanwhile, Linda tried to nurture her daughter with tenderness and care. She told stories, tucked Emily in at night, and reassured her at every milestone. But she could never fully erase the memory of that sacrifice, nor the subtle tension it created. Emily's quiet judgment haunted her. Why did this have to happen? Emily would ask herself in secret, staring at her own reflection in the mirror. She didn't yet understand sacrifice. She didn't yet understand that giving is a form of love. All she understood was absence, loss, and imperfection, the very traits she would subconsciously link to her mother. As adolescence approached, this emotional seed would grow. Emily's inner world became a complex landscape of admiration, fear, and simmering resentment. She would watch her mother interact with the world, noting every limitation, every glance of sympathy from others, every whispered comment that hinted at vulnerability. She would compare herself, note differences, and cultivate a quiet determination to never appear weak. This was the childhood she carried, forged in tragedy, shadowed by loss, and marked by the permanent reminder of that day in the hospital. The story of Emily's first years would shape the trajectory of her life. Every relationship, every choice, every conflict with friends and family would echo back to that morning, that crash, that surgery. And she would carry the truth of her mother's sacrifice as both a shield and a chain, a dual inheritance of love and resentment that would not fully reveal itself until Emily herself became a woman, adolescence is cruel when your reality is already fractured. By the time Emily turned 13, the small apartment in suburban Cleveland had begun to feel both safe and suffocating. She had grown taller than her mother by a year or two, and her once playful eyes were now wary, scanning rooms and hallways as if expecting judgment at every corner. The left eye, her mother's eye, remained a constant, silent reminder of her origin, the price of survival, and the impossible debt she could never repay. School was no escape. Children can be merciless, and Emily became acutely aware of how different she looked. Some of the kids whispered, some stared, and a few even pointed outright. It wasn't cruelty born of malice, it was curiosity, ignorance, and the merciless honesty of adolescence. But to Emily, it felt like the world pointing at a wound she could never hide. She learned quickly. Humor became her armor. Deflection became her shield. Any question about her eye was answered with a shrug, a joke, or silence. Teachers, friends, strangers, all learned the lesson that some wounds are too raw to touch. And yet, beneath the carefully constructed exterior, Emily's thoughts churned endlessly. Why did she do this? She often wondered at night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling. Why give me her eye? Did she love me, or did she want to make me hers forever? This internalized confusion fueled a quiet resentment. She began to view her mother not only as a caregiver but as a figure who imposed sacrifice in a way that was visible, permanent, and impossible to ignore. The eye was more than a transplant, it was a symbol, a daily reminder of what she had lost, and what her mother had lost in her place. At home, the dynamics were complicated. Linda tried to be loving, consistent, and encouraging. She pushed Emily to join school clubs, to excel in her studies, to socialize with other teenagers. But Emily's trust in her mother's motives had been subtly fractured. She obeyed, participated, and performed, but she never fully let her mother in emotionally. She learned to admire, fear, and resent simultaneously. Friendships offered some reprieve. Emily met a small circle of peers who accepted her without question, who laughed at her jokes, and who never asked about the eye. Yet even there, she struggled to open herself completely. Every act of vulnerability felt risky, as though revealing too much would allow judgment to slip through the cracks. Social media became a battleground of self-perception. Photos, posts, and videos reminded her constantly of what normal looked like. Teens flaunted perfect skin, perfect smiles, perfect lives. Emily's reflection, one eye that was not entirely hers, emotions she carefully masked, made her feel exposed, alien, and acutely self-conscious. She started avoiding pictures, hiding in group photos, and always positioning herself strategically. At home, the unspoken tension persisted. Linda never pressured her daughter, yet her presence was always a reminder. She noticed Emily's reluctance, her subtle distancing, but didn't know how to bridge the gap. She feared making things worse, so she retreated into quiet gestures, a sandwich packed for lunch, a story read aloud, an encouraging word whispered at bedtime. But Emily had learned early to view these gestures with suspicion, as if love itself could be a subtle form of control. Teenage milestones, first sleepovers, first crushes, first heartbreaks, were complicated by the ever-present shadow of her mother's eye. Emily began to internalize the belief that attachment came with a price, that love was something to approach cautiously, and that dependency was dangerous. She built walls higher and higher, brick by brick, each one informed by memory, fear, and resentment. One summer, Emily stumbled upon old family photos. Pictures of her as a toddler, eyes wide and innocent, smiling next to her mother, and then a photo post-surgery, the eyes starkly different, her mother's own face altered by the gift she had given. Emily stared at the images for hours, emotions roiling inside her. She felt grief for the child she once was, anger at the mother who had taken an irreversible step, and a deep, unspoken shame for feeling resentment at a gesture meant to save her life. It was the paradox of survival. To live, she owed a debt; to feel, she carried guilt. By the age of 16, Emily's identity was forged along the lines of careful observation, emotional self-sufficiency, and a persistent desire to escape her mother's influence. She excelled academically, often staying up late into the night with her books, not just to learn but to create distance. Sports and art became outlets for expression that she could control, spaces where she could assert herself without confrontation. Yet no achievement could erase the quiet undercurrent of anger that ran through her relationship with her mother. Emily would catch herself glaring at reflections of Linda in mirrors, noting the way she moved, the shadows on her face, the involuntary winces of discomfort. These observations were not just childish pettiness, they were the lens through which Emily understood sacrifice, autonomy, and the complicated architecture of human love. By the time she finished high school, Emily had mastered the art of detachment. She had learned how to navigate a world of peers, teachers, and family with careful politeness, while keeping her emotions locked away. She had learned the hard truth that love, even from those who gave everything, could be a source of both comfort and quiet resentment. And as she stood on the threshold of adulthood, Emily understood one thing with absolute clarity: she would carry her mother's eye with her, literally and symbolically, for the rest of her life. And until she had the opportunity to live independently, she would never let anyone, not even her mother, see the full depth of her anger, her grief, or the complex emotions simmering beneath the surface. Her teenage years had taught her resilience. But they had also planted a seed of rebellion, a determination to reclaim autonomy, to define her own identity, and to confront the emotional inheritance she had been given, even if that confrontation would only come years later. College had felt like a promise of freedom. For the first time in her life, Emily stepped into a world where she could define herself without her mother's eye, her mother's shadow, constantly reminding her of the past. She had earned a scholarship to a university in Chicago, 3 hours away from home, and she took it with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Freedom, however, is never just about geography. Emily met Jason during freshman orientation. He was confident, warm, and remarkably patient. He didn't notice her eye in a judgmental way, he didn't notice at all. He laughed at her jokes, encouraged her in class discussions, and never pressed her to reveal more than she wanted. For Emily, who had grown up learning to withhold emotions, Jason represented both hope and fear. Hope, because he offered connection without demand. Fear, because she had learned that attachment came with invisible costs. They became close quickly. Late-night study sessions turned into shared dinners, walks through the city, and conversations that lasted until the streetlights blinked off. Emily felt something she had never allowed herself to feel: trust without immediate suspicion. But trust is fragile. She visited her mother during long weekends, and the old dynamics resurfaced. Linda's warmth, which had always carried a shadow of expectation, now collided with Emily's new sense of independence. She noticed every hesitation, every wince, every micro-expression that reminded her of the accident, the eye, the debt. Emily started to question herself. Did she resent her mother because of the past, or because she had finally realized she was capable of feelings beyond obedience? Could she forgive while holding on to the anger that had shaped her identity? Jason noticed her tension during a video call one evening. "You're holding something back," he said softly. "You don't have to carry it alone." Emily wanted to confide, to release years of burden in a single outpouring. But she hesitated. How do you explain a life shaped by an accident, a mother's sacrifice, and a lifetime of quiet resentment? She wasn't sure if even Jason could understand. Meanwhile, college brought its own challenges. Group projects, social pressures, and academic competition all forced Emily to confront the discipline and self-reliance she had cultivated. She excelled, but success came with exhaustion, and exhaustion made her memories sharper, her resentments more tangible. A pivotal moment came during her sophomore year. Emily invited Jason to meet her mother, hoping that their connection could bridge the gap. Linda was welcoming, smiling with warmth that seemed to pierce through Emily's defenses. But as soon as Emily's mother tried to engage Jason in conversation, she saw something familiar in his eyes, a respectful curiosity that mirrored the world's gaze on her own injury years ago. Emily felt a wave of protectiveness and anger. No one should see her like that. No one should judge what she did for me, Emily thought. Jason, unaware of the silent storm brewing inside her, tried to navigate the conversation with ease. But Emily felt trapped between worlds: the past she carried, the present she was building, and the fear that her mother's sacrifice would define her forever. The emotional tension reached a breaking point during Emily's junior year. She had been working on a research project for weeks, and the pressure pushed her to exhaustion. Her mother called unexpectedly, asking about a family emergency. Emily, already on edge, snapped. "I can't. I have enough to handle right now," she yelled into the phone, shockingly harsh, even to herself. The silence that followed was unbearable. When Linda finally spoke, her voice trembled with hurt, not anger. "I only wanted to help," she whispered. Emily hung up and immediately regretted it. But the cycle of anger, fear, and love was not easily broken. She realized she had inherited the same patterns she had resented: conflict mixed with guilt, affection mixed with resentment. It was during this period that Emily began to write. Journals, short stories, and personal reflections became a sanctuary. She wrote about her mother, her fear, and her burgeoning love for Jason. Writing allowed her to process what she couldn't say aloud, and slowly, painfully, she began to understand herself. Yet, despite the clarity gained through words, the mother-daughter tension lingered. Emily could no longer ignore the resentment, but she also couldn't abandon the bond entirely. She had to navigate the complex truth: love and resentment could coexist. By the end of her college years, Emily had learned crucial lessons. Love without boundaries is dangerous. Resentment is a signal, not a punishment. Independence does not mean detachment. And she learned something more intimate. Sometimes, the people who hurt us most are also the ones we love the most, and understanding this is the first step toward. Emily graduated college with honors, a promising career path, and a cautious optimism that life could finally be hers to shape. Yet adulthood, she soon realized, came with trials far more intricate than academic deadlines or first loves. Returning home for the first time in years was bittersweet. Cleveland felt smaller somehow, constricted by memories of past sacrifices and unspoken tensions. Linda welcomed her with warmth, but Emily noticed the familiar restraint in her mother's movements, the subtle flinch in her step, the careful tilt of her head to avoid reminders of her lost eye. Emily's emotions stirred in ways she hadn't anticipated. The shadow of resentment was still there, thick and unyielding. Emily found a job at a local publishing company. Her talent and dedication earned her respect, but navigating adult relationships proved challenging. She was fiercely independent, but every decision was filtered through the lens of her childhood trauma. Every trust offered had to be earned, every vulnerability tested. It was during this period that Emily reconnected with Jason. Their bond, once easy and playful, now carried the weight of adulthood, career ambitions, financial independence, and lingering insecurities. Yet, Jason's unwavering support helped Emily confront truths she had long avoided: the depth of her resentment toward her mother, the emotional scars that shaped her identity, and the fragile balance between love and self-preservation. The breaking point came unexpectedly one evening. Emily received a call from her father, Thomas, about a family crisis. Her mother had suffered a minor stroke, not life-threatening, but serious enough to require hospitalization and long-term care. The news unleashed a flood of conflicting emotions: fear, anger, guilt, and an undeniable sense of responsibility. Arriving at the hospital, Emily confronted the woman who had given her one eye, who had shaped her life in ways both profound and painful. Linda looked fragile, a mirror of vulnerability that Emily had seen countless times but never truly internalized. I'm scared, Emily," her mother whispered. "I don't want to be a burden." Emily's heart twisted. She remembered the anger of her childhood, the resentment of her teenage years, and the cautious hope of adulthood. Now, all of it collided in a single moment of clarity. "You're not a burden," Emily said, her voice trembling. "You never were. But I have to accept that I've hated you sometimes. And that's okay. I can't change the past, but I can choose how I move forward." Linda's eyes glistened with tears. For the first time, mother and daughter confronted the truth: love, resentment, guilt, and forgiveness could coexist. The honesty was painful, but it was liberating. Emily stayed by her mother's side during recovery, balancing work and care. The experience forced her to reconcile with the woman she had resented, to see Linda as a human being who had made unimaginable sacrifices, and to understand the courage it took to give up a part of herself so that Emily could survive. Through this, Emily discovered a profound truth about adulthood: life doesn't hand out closure neatly. Healing is messy, complicated, and ongoing. Boundaries must be respected, emotions must be navigated, and love must sometimes coexist with pain. This period also tested her independence. Balancing care for her mother with her own life demanded resilience. Emily learned to set limits without guilt, to assert her needs without resentment, and to embrace vulnerability without fear. Professionally, she thrived. Personally, she faced emotional turbulence head-on. And for the first time, Emily recognized the strength she had always possessed, forged in childhood trauma, honed through adolescent struggle, and tempered by adult challenges. By the end of Part 4, Emily was no longer just a girl shaped by tragedy. She was a woman who had faced the unspoken truths of her family, confronted the lingering shadows of resentment, and begun to reclaim her life on her own terms. Independence is a double-edged sword. For Emily, moving into her own apartment marked more than just physical distance from her parents' home. It was the first step toward claiming her identity outside the shadow of her childhood trauma. Every box she unpacked, every picture she hung on the wall, every meal she cooked for herself became a declaration: She was no longer just a product of circumstance, she was the architect of her own life. Her relationship with Jason evolved too. Unlike in college, where their bond had been tentative and playful, adulthood required honesty, compromise, and courage. Emily learned to communicate her boundaries, her fears, and even her lingering resentment toward her mother. Jason listened without judgment, validating her emotions without attempting to fix them. Through this process, Emily discovered a profound truth: independence is not isolation. It is self-respect, agency, and the ability to make choices without coercion or guilt. She began pursuing passions she had set aside during years of obligation and emotional suppression: painting, weekend hikes, and writing personal essays that reflected her experiences. At work, Emily thrived. She took on leadership roles, mentored younger colleagues, and advocated for projects she believed in. She recognized that ambition and sensitivity were not mutually exclusive; in fact, they complemented one another. Her relationship with her mother also transformed. While the past could never be erased, Emily learned to approach Linda with empathy and honesty. She acknowledged the sacrifice that had shaped her life, while also asserting her right to autonomy and emotional space. They found a delicate balance, one built not on perfection, but on understanding and mutual respect. Financial independence played a pivotal role in Emily's self-discovery. Managing her own budget, paying bills, and making significant decisions for herself instilled confidence she had never felt in childhood. She realized that control over her environment and choices was empowering, and it allowed her to separate her identity from the burden of inherited trauma. Travel became another avenue of growth. Emily visited cities she had only dreamed of, immersing herself in cultures, languages, and experiences that broadened her worldview. Each trip was a small rebellion against the limitations imposed by her early life, a reminder that the world was vast, and her place within it was not dictated by past tragedies. Throughout this journey, Emily also faced setbacks. Moments of loneliness, echoes of childhood resentment, and self-doubt tested her resolve. But she developed strategies to cope: journaling, therapy, mindfulness, and leaning on a trusted circle of friends who offered support without judgment. One evening, Emily reflected on the path that had brought her here. The car accident, the eye transplant, the years of subtle resentment, they had all contributed to the woman she was becoming. Instead of allowing those events to define her negatively, she chose to reframe them as catalysts for growth. She realized that forgiveness was not about excusing past actions, it was about freeing herself from the grip of anger and resentment. She did not need to erase the past to move forward. She only needed to claim her power over the present. By the end of Part 5, Emily had built a life that was authentically hers. She was independent, self-aware, and resilient. She understood that strength was not about never feeling fear or anger, it was about moving forward despite them. Yet, even in her newfound independence, Emily knew there were lessons left to learn. Part 6 would explore reclaiming life fully, finding true empowerment, and embracing the future without the shadows of the past. Healing is not a destination, it is a journey. By the time Emily reached her late 20s, she had learned to navigate life on her own terms. The trauma of childhood, the resentment toward her mother, the challenges of adolescence, and the struggles of early adulthood had all shaped her, but they no longer defined her. Each scar, each memory, each hard-won lesson had become a stepping stone toward self-mastery. Her mother, Linda, had fully recovered from the stroke. Their relationship had matured into something fragile but real: honesty without fear, love without suffocating obligation. Emily no longer saw her mother solely as the woman who had sacrificed an eye, but as a human being with strengths, weaknesses, regrets, and courage. And for the first time, she could feel compassion without guilt, love without resentment. Emily's professional life flourished. She had become a respected editor at a major publishing house, mentoring young writers, and advocating for projects that reflected her values and vision. She thrived not just because of talent, but because she had learned resilience, patience, and the power of persistence. In her personal life, Emily cultivated deep, meaningful relationships. Friendships that had once felt fragile now anchored her. She found love again, this time with someone who understood her past but did not define her by it. Emotional honesty became a cornerstone of her relationships, a skill she had developed through years of careful self-reflection. Travel and adventure remained her sanctuary. Cities, mountains, oceans, each journey reminded Emily of the vastness of the world and the smallness of her childhood fears in comparison. She had learned to embrace uncertainty, to face challenges without retreat, and to revel in her capacity for joy. Perhaps the most profound transformation was internal. Emily no longer measured herself against her mother, the accident, or the expectations of others. She had reclaimed her sense of self entirely. Her mother's eye, once a symbol of debt and resentment, had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder of survival, love, and the complexities of human connection. Emily reflected on the paradox of her life. Tragedy had birthed strength, pain had birthed empathy, loss had birthed perspective. She realized that the moments she once feared, the car accident, the transplant, the resentment, the isolation, were the very experiences that had forged her capacity to thrive. One evening, Emily stood by the window of her apartment, looking at the city skyline. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for a perfect life, but for a life fully lived, a life claimed on her own terms. She had learned that love is complicated, forgiveness is freedom, strength is born in struggle, independence does not mean isolation, and vulnerability does not mean weakness. And in that realization, Emily understood the most vital lesson of all. Life is not about avoiding pain, but about using it to grow, to connect, and to live authentically. She smiled, not because the past had been easy, but because she had survived it, and had emerged whole. Emily's story, shaped by trauma, shadowed by loss, tempered by resentment, and ultimately illuminated by self-discovery, was a testament to human resilience. It was a story of surviving the unbearable, reclaiming agency, and embracing life with courage and authenticity. As the sun set over the city, Emily knew she had finally arrived, not at an endpoint but at the beginning of a life fully her own, a life defined not by what she had lost, but by what she had chosen.